speaker series coordinator as well with the center. We are very excited to welcome back Dr. Mindy Romero today. She's going to be talking with us about political engagement. She is highly engaged in the community herself. She is the founder and the director of the California Civic Engagement Project with the UC Davis Center for Regional Change. She is also the president of the President of the United States, if only. She's the president of the board of the Mutual Housing California, and she's the vice chair of the Social Service Commission for the City of Davis. She holds her PhD in sociology from UC Davis, and she studies political engagement and race and ethnicity. She has been cited in a whole host of major news sources, and she has been invited to speak on community engagement at a number of venues, including TED Talks and the California legislature. So we are very lucky to welcome back Dr. Mindy Romero.
When you mentioned the TED Talk, I thought, oh no, because I don't want to build expectations. This is not a TED Talk. You have to practice a lot for this. How's everyone doing this morning? Or I guess now technically afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm curious, how many of you have come to a previous talk of mine? Well, thank you for those of you who've come again. So, please. So I've got a lot to cover, but I will give just a brief intro for those of you who haven't come to a talk and might not be aware of our research. I do direct the California Civic Engagement Project at UC Davis, and our tagline is research for a stronger, more inclusive democracy. And we do research on civic engagement, do a lot of work on voting behavior, but not just voting behavior. And we hope that our research informs on-the-ground efforts and policy efforts around change, opening up the electorate, making it more accessible, making it more representative of the state and of everyone's interests and needs. So that's the kind of the work that we do. We do a lot of public work, a lot of outreach, and a lot of dissemination of our research to try to get it in the hands of people that can use it in whatever ways that make sense to them. Okay, so I've got a lot to show you, so I'm going to jump in. As you know, I'm going to talk about the 2018 elections. Yeah, good, it works. But to do that, talk about expectations around 2018, we have to step back and talk about 2016 and what we learned and what that can tell us about 2018. So we'll do that briefly, mostly at a national level, but we'll also break out some swing states and close states and dig a little bit into what happened in some of those states, again, as it's instructive going forward. Talk about what to expect in 2018 in terms of a number of factors, of lots of factors that play into that. What we can expect in terms of actual turnout capacity, right? Being a midterm election, very different than a general. What's possible actually, what seats are available and what's possible in terms of the map, geography in the United States at the congressional level, and then a few other factors. And then, of course, we'll talk about demographic change as well, as that is a key factor for 2018, but particularly going forward. Okay, sound good? Everybody's getting settled in, so let's start. So here we talk about data and turnout, just briefly, because there are different ways, different research data sources that we can use. Here I'm using pretty newly published data from the Current Population Survey, which is a product of the census. It is, when we're looking at national data sources, it is the data source. If we want to be able to compare across states, over time, that is the source that researchers use. It's very valuable. It has its limitations, which I'm happy to talk about if folks have questions. But it allows us with this similar methodology or the same methodology over time, it allows us to have that analysis. When you hear me talk about population data, also U.S. Also U.S. Census, CPS, or American Community Survey. Okay. So looking now at 2016 voter turnout. Which screen do I want to look at? I don't like to stand behind the podium, but it makes me a little bit at a disadvantage. So one of the things I have talked about a little bit over the last 6 months or so, 7 months since the election, is just kind of a snapshot of what happened in 2016, right? And now I'm going to, again, go a little bit more deeper. But at a snapshot level, I think you all know, this is the breakdown, right? Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about close to 3 million votes. But of course, Donald Trump won 306 electoral votes versus 232 for Clinton. nearly 100 million of Americans that are eligible to vote, and that would be adult citizens as we measure it with the CPS, didn't vote. And Donald Trump ended up getting about quarter, actually about 28% of the eligible voter population. And again, eligible is adult citizens, but not necessarily registered or not. Okay, let's look at turnout. So I think, actually, before you start looking at that, I think there were a lot of expectations going into 2016. A lot of hopes, a lot of fears, right? A very consequential election, I think, for many, many people, right, regardless of your political affiliation. And I think particularly for certain groups, there was a lot of expectations, and especially given the fact that we had Donald Trump in the race, and there was a lot of rhetoric that was concerning for a lot of groups. Some groups were actually drawn to, but I think particularly around the Latino vote, we saw a lot of discussion, a lot of media, even on the day of the election. We saw speculation about what the Latino vote would be in the United States, what the youth vote would be, but even in Florida, remember, talk about what, were lines already forming what that impact might be. So what I want to do is, all we've had until the CPS released its data, all we had was exit polls. You may have heard some initial information about what the state of the electorate was or looked like. Exit polls are notoriously not reliable, or at least particularly when we break it down into demographic groups, by race, by age, period, going across. And exit polls don't give us turnout. Exit polls give us information about how those that voted, right, what their makeup was, and what their preferences were, but it doesn't actually give turnout. So this is an analysis of turnout. What did we actually look like? Okay. So first off, the total U.S. turnout by this measure, again, comparing over time, 61%, actually flat in 2016 versus 2012, and of course lower than a high mark, not a record mark, but a high mark in 2008. So essentially flat turnout nationally for the total population. Again, eligible. This is all eligible. And again, eligible turnout is percentage of those eligible. So whites actually increased a little bit more than a percentage point. Blacks, African Americans decreased significantly, as you can see here, about 7 percentage points. There was a question, would the high numbers, the very high numbers that we saw in 2008 and 2012 hold for the African American vote? If you're not aware, in 2012, it was the first time with CPS data being measured that we saw the African American vote be higher than the white vote, 66 to 64%, 2 percentage points. Not in California, blacks a little bit lower turnout than whites, but very close. Nationally, African Americans a little bit higher. So what would happen with President Obama not on the ticket, right, and other factors in play, and a significant decrease of 7 percentage points. Latinos, about flat nationally. Again, I'm going to get into some state numbers. And Asian Americans, about 2 percentage points increase. So depending on where you're coming from, this may be disappointing. But there was the flip side. I started with talking about expectations in terms of maybe higher turnout. But of course, we did have so many factors at play that many of us were concerned we're going to turn off voters, right? I should mention that. I got a lot of questions about this in the media. A lot of colleagues were debating about how to factor this in. But the divisiveness, the rhetoric, a lot of times that was framed as something that would bring out people to vote, but also could turn off people, right? The language, some of the topics, right? A certain tape. Parents saying that they had difficulties, right, in being able to talk about the election, right? Period. So there was, in generally speaking, when you feel a lot of folks that aren't happy with either one of the candidates, we wonder what that's going to do to turnout, and that could basically suppress turnout. So depending where you're from, you might have thought or expected to suppress turnout, or you might have thought or hoped or even expected higher turnout. Okay, so I wanted to put 2016 in context, so I said it's flat over 2012. Let's look back. This is actually CPS data at 1980 starting all the way to 2016. And one thing you'll know what you'll notice in the big picture is we've got some high points, 1992, when we had, right, 3 candidates on the ballot, Ross Perot, three major candidates, you'll call it. 2000, 2004 being a higher mark, right, 2008. But one thing that's pretty consistent here is that we've got disparities in turnout. We've got disparities by race. If I was going to show you, I'm not going to show you much about age today because of time, but significant dramatic disparities always present in terms of age, younger versus older. The question is, and these are all presidential, and I'll show you midterms in a little bit. The question is, did we narrow the gap or did we widen the gap? And if you can look at 2012 versus 2016, maybe the simplest way that I can show just to visualize, you can see, depending on what you're looking at, whites going up and other groups going down or going flat. In some ways there was a widening, right? A little bit of a widening in terms of that participation gap. This is just to zoom in 2000. Believe it or not, it's the same chart, just kind of stretched out at the end, 2000, 2016, so you can get a little better look. Everything that I just showed you a moment ago in terms of numbers. And then briefly, youth. I won't show you much about youth, but this is youth, so total 18 to 24, as we're measuring youth. White, non-Latino, 18 to 24, black, Latino, white, non-Latino, black, Latino, and Asian American. And so if you follow that purple line, you'll see that about 43% turnout for 18 to 24-year-olds overall, regardless of race or ethnicity, nationally. By the way, about the same in California. And then you'll see whites actually had an increase for young people in 2016. African Americans a decrease, as we saw for the total population. Latino youth about flat, and Asian Americans a bump up in terms of the youth population. Okay, now let's talk about California. So there has been a lot of talk, and I've even come here and discussed some detailed numbers around California because we use actual voter records for California, and we're able to tease out some demographic information from that. We know that statewide, reported from the Secretary of State's office, we reached about 58% right eligible voter turnout. Looking over that data source, right, the official data source for California from that office, we know that 2016 was right in the middle, kind of in between 2012, higher than 2012, not as high as 2008. But it was the second highest turnout rate in 30 years, 2008 being the highest turnout rate, right? So a good year, I say not a great year at 58%, again, especially given the context and especially given what was going on in California and all the mobilization that we did see, and a lot of money in the campaigns as well that we did see. So hopefully none of us are happy with any of these numbers in terms of just the state of engagement. But so when we use CPS, though, it looks about flat. So we're going to just stay with the same data source so we can compare, okay? So with this measure, we see about flat for California over 2012. And I should say to specify, the first set of numbers are 2016. The second set, the ones in parentheses, are 2012. Sorry about that. Whites in California also increased, but a little bit more instead of 1% like nationally, about 3 percentage points, a little bit more of an increase. African Americans declined much more significantly than they did nationally. So instead of 7 percentage points, in California, it was a 13 percentage point decline. Right? For those of you that do work in the African American or mobilization in the African American community, that's going to be a tough number to see. Asian Americans, a little bit more of a bump in California, higher turnout than nationally. So that's exciting to see. And then Latinos, a little bit, very similar in terms of the national numbers, a little bit of a decline there in terms of these data. We look over time, and this is 2000 to 2016. Again, just visualizing what I showed you there, right? The increase by whites, and then the other groups as well, just to put you in context there. And there's 2008, 2004. Okay, swing states. With me so far? Okay. We'll get past most of these numbers pretty soon, hopefully. And then we'll also talk about the congressional expectations and dig in a little bit there. So on swing states, now, in the end, states that are typically swing states, not all of them swung in the ways that we would think. Not all of them ended up being swing states. Ohio ended up not being that big of a swing state, right? It wasn't that close from one by a much larger number than expected. But just in terms of our traditional swing states, and actually I should have brought you the number. It's a long list, but Virginia, Ohio, New Hampshire, just a long list. But I'll leave that there if you let me. So what I wanted you to gather here, just a brief point, that turnout in swing states is higher. We know that it happened again in 2016. Total 64 versus 60% for non-swing states, and so forth. Okay, just to visualize, this is swing states, non-swing states, U.S. as a whole, right? That red line is swing states, higher. Now let's look at close margin states. What were the close margin states? Here, I did give you a list. It's quicker. So Michigan, right? 10,000 votes. That was the margin that Donald Trump won. And the ones that are bolded are the states that, oh, it should be, oh, sorry, they were changed. New Hampshire, of course, Hillary Clinton won. And then the rest are Donald Trump on this list. Minnesota, Hillary Clinton won. Nevada, Hillary Clinton won. Okay, and we'll go through, of course, Arizona, Donald Trump. But just looking at these first top 5, we can see that Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin alone, right, the Rust Belt states, you heard a lot about this, were decided in total about 77,000 ballots, right? Really, really close. So what the heck happened in those states, right? And I say heck meaning not about whether you're happy or not happy about the results, but period, they performed in ways that we didn't expect. Pennsylvania we knew was going to be a swing state, but some other states, right, were surprises, and certainly in terms of how close they were. The Rust Belt, very much a surprise. And Florida means, to some degree, maybe a surprise for many people, but again, I'll talk about that in a moment. So just kind of moving on. So all of those states together, combined, right, instead of swing states, now close margin states, as I'm calling them, for this purpose. If you look down at 2016, where are we? You can see that in every close margin state, or I'll tell you if you can't see in the back, every close margin state actually saw a decline in their overall total turnout, except New Hampshire and Pennsylvania. So the top closest states, right, 10 top states with the closest vote margins, all of them saw a decline in their turnout, except for Pennsylvania and New Hampshire. Okay. Now let's dig in a little bit. So Michigan, 10,000 votes was the vote margin. Very, very razor thin, right? On election night, razor thin. What happened? So we break it out by race ethnicity, tells you a little bit more. You still see every single group except for Asian Americans declining. So was it whites increasing? What was happening in Michigan? So at least in terms of turnout, this doesn't tell us a full picture clearly. Right? We're not doing a causal analysis, but it gives us some insight. So whites declined, and the purple is the total. African Americans declined more, as we saw in other states. Latinos declined significantly, and then Asian Americans. But something happened with the Latino vote in Michigan. New Hampshire, again, went Hillary Clinton. Really, really close vote margin. And actually, before I do that, let me just take these one at a time. So one quick analysis we did was just to break this out and say, well, what if, as we saw so much decline except for Asian Americans, what if groups just achieved what they achieved in 2012? Not the high mark, right, generally speaking. Oops, I saw a flicker. But what if they achieved the same turnout? What if they didn't see a decline and they had the same numbers as they had in 2012? So if you do the math, just achieve that, both for Latinos and African Americans, the increase in their total voters would have far surpassed the vote margin. Now, of course, not all Latinos and African Americans are going to be voting for Hillary Clinton, but pretty big margins, and we could probably say that it would be an impact. Same thing for the youth vote, period, 18 to 24, regardless of race or ethnicity. If youth had, and then there has been some talk, and I hesitate here because this isn't blaming young people, right, or blaming any of these groups. Really, it's a failure of mobilization amongst probably many other factors. But young people as well would have made the difference with some to spare. Okay, so the flickering is hopefully will be okay. So New Hampshire, we can see again. There's the total. Blue is white. Yeah, African American, Latino, Asian American increasing. We'll just get through these. Pennsylvania, big increase in Asian American. Wisconsin, you can see that, big decreases there. Minnesota. And Florida, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Florida. The same thing, though, goes, what I just mentioned in Michigan, same thing for Florida, in short, and the same thing for Wisconsin. Actually, sorry. Florida and Michigan, African American, Latinos, and the youth vote as a whole, if they had the same rates as in 2012, we would have seen many more voters in those groups than would have made up the vote, would have surpassed the vote margin, if that's clear, hopefully. In Wisconsin, African American voters, not Latinos, but African American voters and young people. Okay, does that make sense with me? Okay, a lot to cover. So let's linger a little bit here with Florida. And we'll make these slides available so you can look into all of these and find many more things that I'm going to highlight today. So in terms of Florida, something that really unusual happened here. So thinking about the expectations with the Florida vote, thinking about a lot of expectations around the Latino vote in Florida, particularly, right? What we saw was an increase in the white vote, and a decrease in the Latino vote, which might surprise many. But if you put it into context and compare it to 2012, it would probably be a very large surprise. So in 2012, Latinos and whites actually had about the same turnout. Latinos technically slightly a little bit higher than whites in Florida. We've never seen that in our state. We've never seen that in our state. It's a very rare occurrence. It's something that's happened in Florida. We saw an increase in 2008, not parity, but an increase in the strong increase in the Latino vote, and then they were able to build upon that and then achieve essentially parity with whites in 2012. So given that, right, and I knew those numbers going into the election, I thought, oh gosh, and then you add in, right, so much mobilization, and of course, don't forget that this is on both sides. 30% or so of the Latino electorate in Florida are Republicans. So what would all this attention bring, right? What would all the mobilization bring? And we can see what we got was an 8 percentage point decline in the Latino vote from 2012 to 2016. Is that surprising to many of you if you think about it? Well, you might have expected, though, with Trump, we just said Trump, you might have expected an increase. We actually saw a decrease. So in my world, just in terms of data, it's surprising because that's a big shift, right, for a big population. Sometimes, as you see in some of the maps, on smaller populations, we'll see shifts because more sensitive on a small population, maybe a given ballot initiative, a given candidate, a big campaign moves in, can galvanize a smaller community, and you see a big shift in numbers, right? Bigger shift if you have, in a very large Latino community, a large community created in Florida, to see shifts like that is very unexpected. Okay. So just to give you a little bit more information, so we're focused on the Latino vote here in Florida, you can see in 2012, right, about parity, this is in terms of representation. So when I talk about representation, we're talking about numeric representation. So a group is represented in an electorate if their share of the electorate of all votes cast, right? So their turnout gives them a share of the vote. If their share of that pie of voters equals to be about their share of the eligible voter population. And because they were about parity with whites, very close to the total overall numbers, they were basically numerically represented. Never seen this in our state, right? Never seen this in our state if you've been to some of my talks before. In 2016, because again, gap, and a pretty significant gap, you can see that Latinos lost representation electorally. Make sense? Okay. So I got a lot of stuff up here because I didn't want to forget it. You don't have to read it. So what happened in Florida? So first off, I alluded to the Republicans. So this is really a Republican and Democratic failure on both sides. Both sides, by all accounts, or many accounts at least, certainly there's those that dispute this, but really failed to engage. There was a factor in terms of Trump and his Cuban policy, and folks are wondering what, if that could have galvanized, particularly some Cuban Latinos. Things are changing within the Cuban community in Florida. Younger folks are less likely to be Republican, but we still have a huge Republican Cuban base there. So both parties failed, or at least did just an abysmal job. But particularly with the Democrats, they left a lot of the outreach to Latino advocacy groups and community groups. Now that happens often. That's great, right? We want to have everyone, right here in California. We see some amazing work that's done by advocacy groups, but I'm talking about trying to explain the numbers. Still, candidates and campaigns are a driving force in terms of mobilization. They're the ones that have the money. They're the ones that have, right, the strategy, the incentives to do this. Advocacy groups are fighting kind of an uphill battle in terms of resources and time and how many are even kind of in the game. We know there were a lot in Florida, but in terms of the parties weren't doing what as much as they could have or should have done. Clinton didn't launch a significant Spanish language ad campaign until September, say that again, right? My understanding is before September, or prior to September, most of the outreach that she was doing in terms of ads were to Latino millennials. Fantastic. Should be doing that, right? But what we understand is that basically the work that Obama had done, and you can see, as I just mentioned in 2012, right, some significant gains, that was not matched by the Clinton campaign. So that was a failure. I was not on the ground, but this is what I understand. So here's something else. For the work that was done, I think there was a reliance on Trump's rhetoric as a rallying cry. And I think very much so, right, rightly placed, right, for the communities that were there. Of course, many Latinos found the rhetoric that was used, the language that was used, right, to be upsetting, to be, generated anger, but also fear, you name it in terms of emotions, feeling disrespected. And so for on many different points, there was a lot of mobilization, and that as a rallying cry worked, right? Trump's words, build the wall, that sort of thing, worked for many, many Latinos, but didn't necessarily work for everyone. Some folks may not like, right, what they hear, but it doesn't mean that that's reason enough to vote, right? Just for lots of other, right, for every population, we see this in California as well. You may not like something that you hear about a politician, but it doesn't, you still have to have a reason to vote. For some, that enough, right, that threat or that disrespect that was felt is enough to vote, but for others, maybe not so much. What was left out of the conversation, at least in sufficient form, was talk about things like education, right? The economy, jobs, healthcare. That was there, and certainly by a lot of advocacy groups that was there, but probably not enough of it. And maybe there was potentially an over-reliance on the rallying cry. And then another thing, long-term work. So we work on the election cycle, and this isn't something unique to the Democratic strategy in Florida, and I've often talked about it. We work on the election cycle, so folks come in, and even advocacy groups too, but folks come in, right, 6 months, maybe, probably 3 months, maybe a month before the election and get out the vote, right? Maybe a few weeks or a couple weeks even before the election. That doesn't, right, for generally historically underrepresented groups, that doesn't work as well as it could and it should. We need to be talking about these issues, why voting matters, why engagement, period, in the larger electoral, political, civic landscape matters, how it's connected to issues that you care about in your family and your community. And that needs to be done all the time, as opposed to right before an election. And I think maybe what was done before an election, right, and that precious time that is there, was not enough on those issues, and more on some other things. So, and then a last point, not to beat up on the Clinton campaign, but this is just a reality of what was on the ground. The Clinton campaign didn't have Latino organizing teams in battleground states, period, or many battleground states, including Florida, until May. Given the size and the opportunity in Florida, that seems, right, to be a very missed opportunity. Okay, so now let's look ahead to the midterm elections. That's 2016. Any questions on 2016 before I move on? Any burning? Okay, make sure we get to the Q&A. Yeah? Oh. Yeah. Yeah. So we haven't done a study on that, no. They're just really more anecdotal in terms of probably some of the things you heard, some of the imbalance and so forth. I will talk about, in a little bit, just more broadly about communication and how it impacted or could impact electorate. One thing I did miss, so there was, and actually the name of the organization is escaping me now. Maybe you might even know if you're on the ground. But there was, I believe, a nonprofit industry organization, media organization, that actually wrote, had multiple members, I don't think necessarily everyone from across the state, but had multiple members from different areas of the state, that wrote a letter to both the Democratic and the Republican parties that actually said, where are you guys? I read it. said, we're not seeing the activity that we typically see, and we're concerned about engagement. We're concerned. So there were folks that were calling the alarm in advance. Okay, looking ahead to the midterm elections. Okay, so speaking of expectations. So again, I think there are expectations, right? Depends on where you're from, what those are, what your lens is. But certainly, I think early on, post-November, maybe a little less in the last month or two, but with starting off the Trump administration, starting off Congress, or at least post-election Congress, there have been a lot of folks that have been out expressing their concerns, right? And we also know we've seen protests for folks that are happy and wanting to defend what they have as well. We've seen engagement. And I do think that we've seen a lot of media, and I think other kinds of pundit kind of conversations that have equated that, right? And even I think from advocacy groups, I've heard this sometimes, that have said, well, all of this engagement, all of this protest, all of this volunteerism, money donated, this activity that we're seeing, gotta mean, right, something in 2018. Usually that conversation has been, it's gotta mean that the Democrats are gonna do strong, right, or have a strong impact. Maybe they're gonna, win back the House, or maybe both, or whatever it might be. But I think we have to be realistic, right? We have to have data, we have to have information, no matter what your inclination is, right, to have an accurate assessment of how to approach the 2018 elections, right? Just to take it in if we're not a player in it, but also if you're a player in it in some way. By thinking that it's a done deal, and I don't think everybody thinks it's a done deal, but if you start to, those kinds of conversations, right, can lead to, here's the danger, not just about being accurate or otherwise, but maybe not as much organization, right? Maybe folks kind of resting on that, right, getting comfortable. For those folks that want to see change, right, congressionally in 2018 or change more broadly in 2020, resting on that, and then the engagement that would need to be done doesn't necessarily get that, right? So let's just break this out. So, and we'll talk about both Democrats and Republicans, but probably a little bit, obviously, more on that narrative in terms of expectations, because that's what we've heard more in terms of Democrats. So when we're assessing what's possible, we need to understand turnout rates. It's a midterm. They're midterms. Midterms are much lower turnout rates, typically 20 percentage points lower, right? And not only are they lower, but here's the kicker, right, that disparities in turnout are typically greater. So there's gaps, as we saw earlier, by race, ethnicity. Again, we could be looking at this at the educational level, income level, age, and we know those gaps tend to widen, generally speaking, in midterm elections. Not always the case, obviously exceptions across the country. But what we do see is typically midterm elections tend to favor Republicans, because the folks that are more likely to fall off of the voting rolls, right, from the presidential to the midterm, tend to be folks of color, at least higher rates, and young people, and Democrats. So that's a context that's important. And I'll break that out a bit more. But we have to also know what seats are even up for grabs. In 2016, we didn't see big swings. Democrats didn't get what a lot of the folks were kind of thinking about or strategizing about would come. The Republicans actually were relatively vulnerable in 2018, congressionally speaking, in terms of the map, having more seats up than the Democrats did. And also with some of the speculation about how Trump would impact many congressional races across the country, we thought we would see maybe potentially more change, but we didn't, right? Democrats only picked up 6 seats in the House in 2016 and 2 seats in the Senate. Now we're going to be, and I'll break this out again in detail in a moment, but we're going to be having a very different map that is actually going to heavily favor, historically it looks like, Republicans. It's going to be a huge challenge in terms of that map. Then, of course, how will Trump be a factor? People are speculating that. We have a lot of time to go between now and 2018. But also related to that, but separate, is how will Congress, right? What achievements it makes or doesn't make, how people react to those, healthcare, budget, infrastructure, all those sorts of things are going to play into this. And really leads me to my fourth factor, is the message fight is going to be absolutely critical, right? And the framing doesn't always match up to reality, but the framing, right? Okay. Technical issues, but I can send you Windows license will expire soon. Yay, okay. Eligible voter turnout. Wait, how did that happen? Oh, okay, I see what I did. Okay, so I already mentioned turnout rates just because of time. I will, again, you can see 20 percentage points lower, right, when we look at the total since 2014. California 2014 was a record low turnout rate. I'll show them to you in a moment. But still, to give you an idea, whites 48, blacks, African Americans 39, Asian Americans 27, Latinos so about 20 percentage points lower, in some places more, in some groups more. Over time, midterms much lower. You can see somewhat of a decline in the 2000s in terms of midterm turnout for all groups. We're going through youth turnout rate. I just wanted to emphasize, right? Lower as well by race. Okay, so what does the congressional map look like? I'll let you, again, peruse those maps later. So midterms are generally bad for the president's party. So in 18 of the last 20 midterm cycles, the president's party lost, and in some cases lost pretty big. Now in this case, the president's party is Republicans who get an added boost, I said, in terms of the shape of the electorate, but still historically a challenge, right? We have seen exceptions. 2006 was one of them, 2006, well anyway, I'll leave that there. In 18, okay, so let's see. So there's fewer swing districts now than there were even 10, but certainly 20 years ago. Fewer crossover districts where the member is different from one party than the presidential candidate who carried the seat. And then a fantastic analysis by 538. If you're familiar with them, I assume many of you are. And this is what they said. Even if Democrats were to win every single 2008, this is so dramatic, I just had to give you the quote, so bear with me. Even if Democrats were to win every single 2008 House and Senate race for seats representing places that Hillary Clinton won, or that Trump won by less than 3 percentage points, they still wouldn't get the House and maybe even lose, right, a number of Senate seats. So a historical challenge. Yes, and I think I'll leave it there. Okay, so the House advantage for Republicans. So of course, we've got right now 194 to 240 Republican seats. Democrats need 24. In California, it's going to be ground zero for that because 7 of those seats that Democrats are targeting are right here in California. So likely, if the Democrats don't pick up, right, the seats in California, they're not going to pick up enough seats. If they don't win, they're going to have to go to southern and rural Midwestern states, potentially even harder in many of those areas. The map, just to show you again, you can look at these slides later, but I wanted to show you some of the challenges there visually. And then the Senate advantage, 25 seats, 9 Republican seats, 50% of all the seats Democrats control are up in 2018. Of course, the Senate is not really in play here in California. We assume Dianne Feinstein's going to run again, but either way, it's going to be a Democrat. So it's the House that we're talking about. 10 of the 25 states are in states that Trump won in 2016. 5 of those are Trump states. And really the most vulnerable are Arizona and Nevada. So Jeff Flake and Heller. Okay. And there's the Senate map. All right. And then just to add a little bit, just I think about a week ago, the Cook Political Report came out, gave an adjustment to the Senate. If you're not familiar with the Cook Political Report, one of the many things they do is they size up, right, districts and races across the country. Does it lean Democrat? Is it a toss-up? Does it lean Republican? And so forth. And changing 5 Senate seats from lean Democrat to toss-up. Another challenge there. Okay, but the battle will be fought here in California. Battle for congressional control, but I did just want to mention not just about congressional races, but California is a huge source. It's the #1 source, or the #1 state in terms of money into presidential campaigns. And it's a huge source, period, of money across the state, across the nation, but also in terms of advocacy networks. Many networks start here, many networks go through here. Don't forget that there's trainings that happen here. There's a lot of national leadership in terms of advocacy issues, but in terms of mobilizing, particularly, that happen in our state. So we're influential in that way as well. So I mentioned those 7 states just to give them to you, 7 congressional districts, just to give them to you. And again, these are what the Democrats, this is their strategy. So Jeff Denham, right? So we'll Turlock, Hanford, Palmdale, Fullerton, Irvine, Costa Mesa, Vista. Of all of these, Jeff Denham and Darrell Issa are the 2 most vulnerable. Jeff Denham is in Turlock, in a district that also is rapidly changing. Well, I suppose also Darrell Issa, but rapidly changing demographically. So they're all Clinton districts. Many outdid Trump in terms of performance, the candidates. On the Republican side, they've officially stated, at least thus far, that there are about 4 candidates. No surprise, Omni Berra. He's had razor-thin races, right, in the 2 elections that he's had, 2012 and 2016. I think 2016 might have been the most expensive or the second most expensive in the country. We're going to have money, period, coming in for all of these races, but Omni Berra will probably be leading that. They think he's vulnerable. But still, tough GOP pickups, generally speaking here, all in Clinton districts. Okay. And then I just wanted to remind everybody, the chart I showed a few months ago when I was here 6 months ago. We think of us as a blue state, but of course we are shades of blue, as I like to say, shades of blue in many, many communities of red. And that is important to acknowledge and understand when we're thinking about political strategy, which of course the political consultants understand this deeply, but also in terms of issues and kind of a public narrative as we discuss things. But I will move on. So in 2018, I'm going to quickly talk about demographic change, and then I'll close it up. I wanted to separate this topic out purposely, obviously impacting 2018, but I wanted to kind of have a clean conversation around demographic change. So also too many things on this slide, but a few things I think just need to be read to kind of get a sense of where the Republican Party was in 2012. So the autopsy on the 2012 election, right? Republicans lost the presidency, a presidency that they thought they were going to win. Mitt Romney was convinced, not just Karl Rove, but all the leaders of the Republican Party nationally were convinced that that was a race that they were going to win. Lots of reasons why they lost it, including bad data. But after that, there was an autopsy that was done for what happened at the presidential level and at the congressional level. And it called for inclusion, not policy change necessarily, but inclusion, right? So a lot of that's around language and outreach and explaining policy, right? Not letting Democrats take that narrative over and talking about how the issues of the Republican Party do matter to many, many people, right? So saying that previously their message, this is a quote, this is from Rance Priebus. Message was weak, our ground game was insufficient, we weren't inclusive, we were behind in both data, as I mentioned, and digital. Our primary and debate process needed improvement, and he said that about Mitt Romney's GOP loss. There's no one solution. There's a long list of them. They concluded what was needed was extensive outreach to women, African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, and gay voters. That they, I left off a quotation mark there, but that they needed to back comprehensive immigration reform. And they talked about softening that language, right, the rhetoric. That for many folks, particularly the Latino community, when you're talking about immigration reform, sometimes it's the language, it's the tone that is used, not even necessarily the specific policies, that just can be a trigger, right, and even a litmus test to concluding that that is not a friendly politician or not a friendly party, right, to my community. So understanding and recognizing that language matters, tone matters. Make sense? And Priebus said, I think it's about being decent. I think it's about dignity and respect, that nobody deserves to have their dignity diminished, or people don't deserve to be disrespected, right? And I think we all would agree with that here, and that was a conclusion in 2012, sorry. What we saw, though, was not a bigger tent. I think there were certainly a lot of money that went out and a lot of outreach hires that were made initially after the report. It went out across the United States, from what I understand. But when it came down to, and I think that was the attempt going into 2016 in terms of the slate of candidates and the approach by the party initially, but of course, things changed. And we had Donald Trump, which changed the tone, the rhetoric, so many things, and policy. Although not so much, in some areas, actually not so much of a big change in policy, but again, tone and language and extent. Okay, so demography, though, is still political destiny. So you may think, well, gosh, they concluded that, but heck, they must be thinking now, right? They didn't have to go that route. that, that Trump's approach worked, and it worked by, as we've heard a lot, right, this assumption that it worked with white voters. And it did work with white voters. We didn't see a huge increase in white turnout, but it did work with a lot of different groups. And maybe in the Q&A I'll get into that if you're curious and want to talk about that more. But does that mean that big tent or the conclusions of the autopsy no longer stand? Well, of course they do, right? And demography is still a political destiny. I don't think it necessarily has to benefit Democrats because, for instance, with the Latino vote, it isn't actually monolithic. And much of what we've seen with Latinos gravitating towards Democrats has also been in response, particularly here in California, response to the Republican Party, right? Prior to Proposition 187, we actually, the balance, right? Latinos were just a little bit more Republican in their registration than Democrats, if you didn't know, than Democratic, if you didn't know. But as a response, as we've seen in 187, did tremendous, right, movement, gave us a tremendous movement of Latinos registering as Democrats, right, and kind of cemented that perception out there, very strongly so. So demography is still political destiny. So my points here, so even if turnout rates don't increase, we've got a changing US. We've got a changing California. Latinos, just as of about a year or so ago, year and a half ago, were estimated to be now the majority. We were at plurality for a little while and probably just barely the majority. Not majority, sorry. We're at parity, and now we're just a polarity in the state, being the most numerous and the largest percent. Trying to rush makes me have to be more careful, though. Nationally, the Latinos are projected to be about 29% by 2040, up from 17%. In California, about 45% in 2040, up from about 39% now. Not everywhere. Just as in California, we will have areas that will have tremendous growth in the Latino population. And I'm focusing here on Latinos because that is a group that is going to be driving the demographic change, the population pie, the proportions will be Democrats. We'll see tremendous change amongst Asian Americans as well. But because Latinos are much more numerous, they're driving that kind of demographic change story. So as in California, there's many areas that won't see as much change in terms of numbers. Many areas that will. In the United States, there's many areas that we won't see a lot of change. But there will be 3 key swing states, if you still call Nevada and Colorado a swing state. Certainly Nevada was. And Florida. Huge Latino populations probably will be heavily influencing those swing states even more going forward. As I mentioned, Latinos, though, aren't a monolith. So their loyalty can't be taken for granted, i.e. Florida. But politically, they can't necessarily be taken for granted. GOP brand is now linked, many would say, to racialized discourse, right, because of Donald Trump. That's going to be difficult, very, very difficult to change for the Republican Party, as we've seen here in California as a kind of glaring example. Once that narrative was set with 187, right, Republicans are still very much suffering from that. And we know that registration is about 26-25% Republican now in California. We used to be, 20 so years ago, we used to be a solidly Republican state, right? Republican governors. So that brand from Donald Trump, if it transfers over into California, that also now could give us, in California, potentially another generation of, you know, the 187 generation, we're starting to get a little old. Not anybody here is old. You remember you're not old. But younger kids, yeah, our youth, right, didn't live through that time. But now we may be having another. So we'll have to see what the Trump effect is in terms of the Republican brand, but there's a lot of concern there in California. Okay, U.S. population, I already mentioned this, but Latino 17%, Black about 13%, Asian American 5%, right, still almost 70% white. The share of the white vote has changed dramatically over time because of demographic change driving this, not the only reason, but driving it. So in 1980, from 90% white to 73% in 2016, right? We're looking at presidential to presidential. Blacks from 9% to 12%, Asian Americans 1.7 to 4%, and that's from when the numbers were available in 1998, and Latinos 2.6 to 9.2 nationally. Now this only goes to 2014 because I couldn't update this lovely, beautiful chart. But you can see the change over time, right? The blue line is white, so that's the declining share of the white vote. and steadily increasing from other groups. Wait till I get to California. California Latino vote. What do you think? I already gave you these numbers. Latinos, and this is 2014, so it's changed a little bit more. So Latinos are about 39% of the state's population, as I just mentioned. African Americans are a smaller piece of the pie here in California, if you weren't aware, about 6%, and that is declining. And Asian Americans about 14%. 1980, I just wanted to show you the change in our state. You indulge me for a moment. See that? Same colors, right? Same groups. Big change, right? And again, more change is on the way. And in the Central Valley, where folks like Jeff Denham are. Demographic impact on the California vote, really quickly from 1980 to 2016. Pretty close to the US vote, 89%, almost 90%, same numbers. Different story, though, in terms of demographic impact. Now, 55% of voters, because more whites have higher turnout rates, but 55% of voters, whites are, of the actual pie of voters in the 2016 election with these data. African Americans, 5.9%, Asian Americans up to 14%, and oh, actually, I think that's a typo there. Forgive that. And then Latinos, 23% now, right? What used to be about 6%. So now the same chart I showed you a moment ago for the U.S. Remember that steady decline in the share of the white vote, or the white share of the vote? Much more dramatic, right? Particularly since 2000 in California. Okay, so demographic change, it helped impact and drive political representation, right? And certainly, certainly party domination in our state. Latinos have been a driving factor in the domination of the Democratic Party. Now, just a few quick slides here in terms of population. So I mentioned this already, but I want to show you. So this is U.S. total projection of the population. We've all heard the number that we're going to be at 2044, say it right, we'll lose the white majority, right? Whites will be a minority in the country, with all other groups combined. By 2060, whites themselves will be about 43%. And then you can see where's the line that's most, there's the Latino population, right? As I mentioned, kind of dominating that proportional change story. California, so now we're at about 2017, about 39%. Here, white is blue, Latino is green, Asian American is purple, sorry for the color change, and red is African American. You can see that we're on now a different trajectory, and by 2040, 45% projections, this is by the California Department of Finance, Latino, 30% white, and African American, about flat in numbers, but again, proportionally, actually declining to 5%. And then, really quick, just want to show you some differences across regions, and it gets really fascinating when you look across counties, and we have those data we're happy to share, and we have the data by ourselves by eligible voter population. But just really quickly, I'll show you for regions. So that's California. With me? Silicon Valley. Here, you'll see the Asian American population is actually the second most, right, highest proportion, if you will. Sacramento, much smaller Latino, proportionally Latino community. This is the Sacramento region. San Joaquin Valley, there's going to be a meeting of both whites and Latinos, right, about 2025. LA region, a little bit sooner, but smaller proportions, if you will, smaller numbers. And there we go. So it really depends on where you are in the state, at what time in the state, as I've mentioned before, that magnitude and the timeline in terms of how demographic change is going to impact California and things like congressional races and local races. All right. In conclusion, my takeaway, we're just focused in on 2018 House right now, or 2018 Congress. The map is not friendly to Dems, as I've mentioned. The battle for control for Congress will be a battle over a narrative. It's going to be, a lot of it's going to be here in California. Demography is still political destiny. It doesn't have to be that way, but unless some things change, right? But groups can't be taken for granted. And engagement now must be translated to engagement at the ballot box, and that's just to pull back around to when I first started talking and mentioned about all the energy that we're seeing across the country, right? So There's a lot we could say there, but I'll say in terms of just tying it to the vote, that doesn't necessarily predict turnout. As a matter of fact, we know a lot of folks that are engaged, right, across demographic groups, across geography in the United States. Many of those folks that are volunteering, protesting in the streets, spending money, will not necessarily actually cast their vote at the ballot box. There's all kinds of engagement. There's all kinds of political engagement. There are folks that can't vote, right, because of citizenship status, because of age, but they can participate in the electoral process by supporting others, right, and campaigning and mobilizing. They can participate in the larger political process like protesting and volunteering, and they certainly can participate, obviously, in the larger civic process by helping to inform policy change, right, and community change. But it's not a given in terms of electoral change, and obviously it's a much harder, higher hill to climb without electoral change if you're interested in electoral change, or if you want to not see change, right, you have to have it at the ballot box too, right? So we need to make sure that we make that connection, that we don't make assumptions because maps are difficult, demographics are difficult. Communities that want change historically have many many barriers, right? Institutionally, lack of mobilization, outreach, so many things that we could talk about. So we can't take that engagement for granted. The work has to be done. The work has to be done. And I think not trying to be the pessimistic person here, but trying to talk about the reality, particularly in terms of the turnout possibilities, and in terms of the map, but also in terms of demographics. What we need to consider as we move forward. Thank you. Did you have a question, sir? Yeah, I'm going to hang around. I'm going to stay around.